The film begins with Frank Morris, a hardened criminal and skilled escape artist, being transferred to Alcatraz, a maximum security prison located on a lonely island in San Francisco Bay. Since it houses the most dangerous and incorrigible inmates, this prison has become famous for being impossible to escape from. Upon arrival, Frank undergoes a harsh prison intake procedure, including a strip search. He is then led to his cell, where he is expected to spend the rest of his days. The next morning, Frank has breakfast in the dining hall, where he meets Litmus, a friendly old man who keeps a pet rat with him. Litmus shares his food with him, and they strike up a conversation. However, he also notices another inmate nearby, Wolf, who openly tries to intimidate him. Frank, completely unimpressed, ignores him and continues his conversation with Litmus. Later, Frank is summoned to the warden's office, where he receives a stern briefing. The warden explains that Alcatraz is the place where society sends its most uncontrollable criminals. He emphasizes that no one has ever managed to escape from here. He warns Frank not to try. But while the warden is lecturing him, Frank discreetly steals something from his desk, a pair of nail clippers. A small but defiant gesture. Back in his cell, Frank hides the clippers in his Bible, and the thought, "with great power comes great responsibility," hangs clearly in the air. Here, power wasn't about brute strength, but about the choices you made to survive. Later, during the communal shower, Wolf approaches Frank and makes lewd, offensive remarks. Without hesitation, Frank responds by hitting him in the groin and shoving a bar of soap into his mouth, leaving his opponent humiliated. Frank calmly finishes washing up, further cementing his reputation as someone you don't want to mess with. The library becomes a place of respite for Frank, where he meets English, the librarian who has long come to terms with spending his life in Alcatraz. English is passionate about books and history, and a friendship develops between them. During a walk in the yard, Frank also meets Doc, a talented artist who is painting a self-portrait. Doc says that the prison can only control his body, but not his spirit. He mentions that he used to grow chrysanthemums, which he saw as a symbol of hope. But in Alcatraz, hope is a dangerous thing. It either keeps a person afloat or shatters their dreams against harsh reality. For Doc, his art became his salvation. For now. That same evening, a guard tells Frank about the opportunity to work as a carpenter for 15 cents an hour. Frank agrees, and the guard addresses him in an unusually friendly manner. But soon, trouble starts to brew. During another walk in the yard, Wolf comes back with a shiv and tries to attack Frank. However, Doc manages to warn him in time, and Frank fights back, using his jacket as a shield. A fight quickly breaks out, which ends with Wolf attacking the guard who tried to break them up. As a result, both Wolf and Frank are punished. Wolf is sent to solitary confinement, as is Frank, even though he was only defending himself. After 2 exhausting weeks in isolation, Frank returns to his cell. Litmus lifts his spirits with a note delivered by his pet rat. Frank also meets his new cellmate, Charlie Butts, who is serving time for car theft. Charlie confesses to Frank that he regrets crossing state lines. That made his crime a federal offense. Meanwhile, the warden makes an unannounced inspection of the cells. Entering one of the inmates' cells, he notices a detailed portrait of himself painted by Doc, and at first appears flattered. However, he later takes revenge. He orders the guards to confiscate all of Doc's art supplies, leaving him alone with emptiness. Despite Frank's attempts to support him, Doc withdraws into himself. During a shift in the carpentry workshop, Doc, in despair, chops off 3 of his own fingers with an axe. A desperate protest against losing the ability to paint. The guards, panicking, try to give him medical assistance, while Frank, who witnessed the incident, simply watches in silence. Here, include this in the report. That same night, after returning to his cell, Frank notices a cockroach crawling into the vent under the sink. Intrigued, he checks where the vent leads. Meanwhile, English approaches Frank, and he tells him that the warden took away Doc's right to paint because he didn't like the portrait. During the next meal, Frank sits at the table with John and Clarence Anglin, brothers he knew from a previous stint in prison. They discuss the grim atmosphere in Alcatraz and the fact that the cold waters surrounding the island make escape impossible. However, at that moment, an idea sparks in Frank's mind. That same night, using the stolen nail clippers, Frank begins chipping away at the concrete around his vent. He does this methodically, hiding the nail clippers in the Bible and pretending to read whenever guards walk by. Gradually, the concrete becomes thinner, and his plan starts to take shape. The next day, during outdoor recreation, both Charlie and English receive rare visitors. English struggles to find words as he sees his grown-up daughter. And Charlie's wife brings terrible news. His mother is seriously ill and has only a few months left to live. This realization pushes Charlie toward the idea of escape. The next morning, Frank gathers John and Clarence, and the three of them begin to develop a strategy. Frank suggests that because of the salty air and humidity, the prison infrastructure is highly susceptible to corrosion. This means they can gradually pry out the ventilation grills and get into the service shafts. His enthusiasm inspires the others, and they decide to work together so that one day they can escape. That night, Frank continues chipping away at the concrete around the grate in his cell using stolen nail clippers, while Charlie keeps watch for the guards, ready to whistle if they appear. Despite the progress, Frank starts to get frustrated that the work is going too slowly with the clippers, and his fingers are getting very tired. The next morning at breakfast, he tells the group about it. While they're racking their brains for a new method, Frank notices his spoon and comes up with a new trick. He secretly dirties the spoon on the sole of his shoe and calls over a guard, complaining that his utensil is dirty. The others, catching on, do the same thing. The guard swaps out their spoons, unwittingly aiding their escape plan. At the table in the center, while John distracts the guard with conversation, Frank takes advantage of the moment and discreetly hides an extra spoon. However, one tool isn't enough. Frank trades 20 servings of dessert with Latmus to get more materials. He breaks the spoon in half and combines the pieces with tweezers and a coin, which he grinds into powder. Using the heat from a match, he fuses all the elements together. This way, making holes in the wall becomes much more effective. That same evening, Frank starts chipping away at the wall again, while Charlie keeps watch. The new tool works through the concrete much faster. However, while they're working, one of the guards comes by for an inspection. Charlie, who has dozed off, doesn't manage to warn him in time. English comes to the rescue, distracting the guard with conversation, while Charlie hurriedly bangs on the bars to warn Frank. Frank covers the grate with the accordion-style box and joins in the conversation with the guard, who doesn't notice anything suspicious. When the guard leaves, Frank gets back to work, although now he sees Charlie as not the most reliable partner. Over time, Frank realizes that the grate is fastened with bolts, and he'll need something else to remove them. The next day, during the yard walk, Frank discreetly gets rid of the concrete crumbs. Later, in the carpentry workshop, he makes a wooden wedge to loosen the bolts. Knowing that he'll have to pass through a metal detector when leaving the workshop, Frank gets crafty. He hands the guard a different piece of wood, while hiding the wedge in his shoe. Back in his cell, he uses the wedge to pry out the bolts and remove the grate, revealing a system of pipes behind it that could lead to freedom. But Frank realizes he needs to carefully plan the next steps. He suggests making papier-mâché dummy heads to fool the guards during night checks. The team divides up the tasks. John collects hair in the barbershop, Charlie gets the paints, and Frank uses English to get newspapers. Frank starts creating with the newspapers and magazines. They mix wall crumbs with water to make a cement-like mixture for molding the heads. Charlie carefully paints the faces, making them realistic enough to pass for sleeping inmates. To make the disguise even more convincing, Charlie creates a fake grate to imitate the one he removed. One night, Frank decides to do some reconnaissance. Crawling through the hole behind the vent grate, he climbs up the pipes to the upper level, but runs into a steel door. He tries to jump up to it, but it's no use. At that moment, a guard enters his cell. It was a dangerous moment. The whole team realizes that the plan needs some adjustments. Morris. What? The next day at lunch, Charlie and Frank tell the others what happened. Despite the setback, John and Clarence manage to finish their dummy heads, and the group continues working. Charlie and John sneak back to the pipes to take a closer look at the route. They reach the steel door and discover that it is secured with heavy metal plates. To remove them, they need tools they don't have yet. During one of the music classes, Charlie notices an old fan and realizes it can be turned into a homemade drill. He strikes a deal with the inmate Latmus, giving up all his future desserts in exchange for the necessary parts. To smuggle the fan past the guards, Charlie hides it in a musical instrument case. When questioned, he simply replies, "For this one." Fortunately, the guard, caught off guard by such boldness, lets Charlie through. Back in the block, Frank examines the iron bars and the exhaust hood covering the exit to the roof and uses the fan to craft an improvised drill to loosen the fastenings. The noise attracts the attention of the guards, but they don't pay it any mind. That night, when the passage was cleared and the homemade rafts were almost ready, Frank sets the escape for Tuesday evening. Later, on the appointed day during lunch, Frank places a chrysanthemum on the table in memory of Doc, but the warden comes over and crushes it, reminding Frank of the rules. Litmus flies into a rage and tries to attack the warden, but dies of a sudden heart attack. Later, the warden orders a search of Frank's cell but finds nothing suspicious. He got lucky, but now he hears Frank and Charlie talking late into the night about something, so he orders them to be moved to different cells as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Wolf is released from solitary confinement and intends to stab Frank, but English manages to stop him in time. That same night, Frank, John, Clarence, and Charlie plan to meet in the corridor and escape. However, Charlie falls into a nick and decides not to take part in the escape, staying in his cell. The others continue on. Alone in his cell, he quietly cries, realizing that his dream of freedom is slipping through his fingers. Frank, John, and Clarence, taking the inflatable raft with them, make their way onto the roof and hide from the searchlights. Meanwhile, Charlie is struggling with his own fears. Hesitating, he finally decides to join the escape and makes it to the steel gates separating him from freedom. But without someone's help, he can't climb up. And at that moment, he fully realizes that he has missed his chance. Meanwhile, Frank, John, and Clarence successfully get past the barbed wire and head toward the edge of the prison. They quickly slip into a small grove, cross a deserted road, and reach the shore. Moving as quietly as possible, they take out the inflatable raft and begin to inflate it. Finally, the raft is ready. They put on their homemade life vests again, climb onto the raft, and set off into the icy waters of the bay. With each stroke, they move further and further into the unknown, leaving behind the grim silhouette of Alcatraz. In the morning, the guards begin their usual rounds in the prison. When the warden enters Frank's cell, it looks as if Frank is still sleeping in his bed. But as he comes closer, he discovers it's only a dummy. Panic erupts in the prison. Sirens blare, and the guards are running everywhere, searching the prison and the surrounding area. English watches the commotion from afar with a barely noticeable smile. Against all expectations, someone has accomplished what was thought to be impossible: an escape from Alcatraz. The warden immediately launches a large-scale search on the island and in the surrounding waters. Boats and helicopters comb the bay, but find no trace of the escapees. All that remains are a few photographs of raincoat-clad figures and a solitary flower, a sinister yet poetic reminder of the freedom these people sought. Most of the prison staff believe that the escapees drowned in the bay, given the strong currents and icy water. Surviving in such conditions seems impossible. But the warden is not so sure about that. Deep down, he suspects that the escapees managed to get away. However, in order to preserve his reputation and the intimidating legend of Alcatraz, he officially declares that the escape was unsuccessful, claiming that the escapees perished in the bay's waters. In this way, he reinforces the idea that Alcatraz is a place from which escape is impossible. But in reality, history turned out differently. A year later, the prison was closed forever, and despite lengthy investigations, nothing is still known about the fate of the escapees. Did they drown in the bay, or did they live out the rest of their lives in freedom? One of America's greatest unsolved mysteries.